everyone, on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast, I've got Paul Schnackenburg back on the show, and today we are talking about the security of the Windows boot process. Now, I feel like definitely end users don't know, and I feel like a lot of sysadmins, they kind of take the security of the boot process for granted. There's actually quite a lot of security baked into the Windows boot process that is doing a lot of footwork before the OS is even booted. Now, that said, there have been some recent leaks of platform keys and some other things that we're going to talk about in this episode that have somewhat undermined the security of the boot process. So we're going to be talking about that and lots more on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Well, everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insight straight from the security lab here at Hornet Security. As always, I'm your host, Andy Syrewicze, and I've got our very regular co-host back on the show. I've got Paul Schnackenburg. How's it going, Paul?
I'm good, Andy. How are you?
Doing good. Hey, I start every episode with this, right? It's been an interesting world in security out there, and I feel like we're changing gears a little bit today. So I'm kind of excited about that. I feel like for the longest time, you and I have been talking about current security problems, big things that have been happening in the news, people getting attacked, breaches at various companies, right? Today we are actually, I don't want to say deep dive because there's not enough time to deep dive this particular topic, but we are kind of talking about something that's, at least in my opinion, is not talked about enough. And one of our earlier conversations in a previous episode is actually what prompted this. And of course, today we are talking about the security of the Windows boot process. And I'm blanking on what episode it was we were talking about that. I'm sure I'll find out at some point. But it just seemed like a fun topic to talk about because, the BIOS days are long behind us. And I mean, I don't know if any of our listeners are old enough to remember the BIOS days. I hope there are. I hope we're the only two not old enough to remember the BIOS days. And the BIOS days, the BIOS kind of, you turn on the computer, the BIOS was like, hey, hardware, everybody good? You good? Okay, good. Hey, bootloader, boot the OS. Done, right? And
that was it.
And it's not that simple anymore. We have, and I think certainly your average user doesn't know, but I think there's a lot of sysadmins out there that don't really understand all of the security that is baked into the Windows boot process. And so, I mean, I went out and kind of refreshed myself on the whole process from start to OS running. And even I was surprised. I'm like, whoa, there's more I knew there was a lot, but there's even more than I was expecting. So that's kind of what we're focusing on today. And we're also going to be talking about some current threats for this boot process as well. So should be an interesting podcast episode, I think. So what do you think, Paul? Should we dive right in here?
Let's see what we can do. So, it is the basic in-out system. That's why it was called BIOS. It was basic, for sure.
Sure was.
As opposed to the unified extensible firmware interface, which is much more of an actual little sort of operating system almost, the firmware that sits before your actual Windows or Linux or whatever you run actually boots on your computer.
And so I have to ask, so do you call it UEFI or do you call it UEFI? I've always been more on the UEFI side of the conversation, but maybe I'm just weird.
No. I think I do both. I was sort of spelling it out, I think, just to get to the acronym, because I like to spell out acronyms because we use a lot of acronyms in IT, and
we do.
It excludes people if they don't know what the acronym actually stands for, right? Because then you can't listen to the next thing somebody's saying because you're thinking, what does that actually mean? So right. I just clarify that. But no, UEFI, yeah, I'll go UEFI too.
Yeah, and so that is ultimately what has replaced BIOS now. To your point, we have almost like a little contained operating system that loads before the OS loads. And I don't know if you ever watched South Park, Paul. If I go all the way back to one of the very first episodes of South Park, there's an episode where Cartman was talking about appetizers. And he's like, well, appetizers are what you eat before you eat to make you more hungry, right? And I feel like that's what UEFI is, right? It's like the little OS we start before we start the OS so that we can get the full OS. And we're, I don't know, 4.5 minutes in and I'm off the rails already. Anyway, let's talk about what the boot process actually looks like in modern Windows. And so
Yep.
at a high level, what we have here is post, right? So system starts. Hey, all the hardware, everybody good? You ready? Okay, cool. And then
Known as power on self-test, hence
correct.
the name Post.
Post. Correct. Thank you. And then we get into the initial bootload via UEFI. So UEFI takes over at that point and gets everything ready for the next couple of steps in the process here. Now, the next start of the process is called, so let me back up here. So we got post, and then we have, I want to go with the official names here. The initial bootloader phase is what that phase is called, where UEFI kicks in. At that point, we move into the boot manager phase, and that's where the boot manager pulls the boot configuration data from the partition. So that is BCD. So sometimes you see that acronym when you are dealing with partition information and boot information inside of the Windows operating system. So again, that stands for boot configuration data. Once that information is pulled by boot manager, it then hands things off to winload.exe for the phase that is called the Windows OS loader phase. And this particular phase is responsible for basically loading those core essential drivers, things like storage drivers, right? So that, the kernel can actually read the disk and write to the disk that you're booting from, et cetera, et cetera. It also, that particular phase starts kind of the early phase of getting the kernel ready. It then passes it off to the fifth phase, which is the kernel initialization phase. And that's where the Windows kernel initializes, or in the Linux world, we would call that init, right? Init. And so that's where the Windows kernel kicks in, and we get one of the, I guess, one of the unsung heroes of the Windows boot security world that nobody knows about, ELAM, which stands for Early Launch Anti-Malware. And
That's right.
basically, ELAM is, what it's doing is, again, this is all happening during the boot process. Windows isn't even loaded fully at this stage, and there's already a security service kicking in to basically look at all the drivers and say, hey, are any of these drivers in the image I'm booting, is anything malicious, right?
Yep.
And so ELAM is checking for malicious drivers at that stage. And then
Yep.
once that is done, then we finally move to the login phase, where the user is presented with their nice shiny login page and the boot process is done.
Yep.
So that's the boot process at a high level. There's a lot more details than that, but at a high level, that's kind of what the boot process looks like today.
Right. So now let's talk a little bit about the security features we get out of this. So one of them is trusted boot. So that means that the boot process is going to look at the components that are loaded as it is booting and say, do I trust these? Are they signed? Are they the ones I expect them to be? And it's also going to measure it. And this is an interesting feature of Secure Boot, which we'll come to in a second. And Measure Boot is looking at how long does it take this component or that component to load? And does it load the same way as I expect it to? In other words, it's sort of fingerprinting the boot up process of the computer and then comparing that fingerprint every time it boots. Because if you're a malware author, of course, we'll get to Bootkit and Rootkits later on, but if you get one of those, no matter how carefully they do it, they're not going to match the measurements of the good boot that was there last time, right? And therefore, that measured boot is going to say, hang on, something's happened. Now, that may not be malicious, right? It might be that I don't know, your motherboard died and you picked up your drive and you plugged it into another motherboard, right? And you're trying to boot it up, and it's going to say, well, this isn't the same motherboard I was in. It's a different TPM chip, whatever. And you're now in a recovery mode where you need to sort of get your BitLocker recovery keys or whatever else to get back up and running. And overall, this is called Secure Boot. And Secure Boot is the feature that basically has been in place for way over 10 years at this point,
It's been a while.
and is designed to stop rootkits.
Yep, exactly. And, it's funny, as you were explaining measured boot there, it kind of reminds me of those ultra secured data centers where I've only been in one or two of these, where if you're delivering equipment, they want to know how heavy the equipment is. So they weigh you when you go in, and then they weigh how much you weigh by yourself without the equipment. And then when you come out, they weigh you again to make sure you're not taking something out with you, right? And so it's kind of the same process, right? Like you said, you're kind of fingerprinting the boot process. That way, the next time the system boots, is there anything funny going on, right?
Yep, that's right. That's a good analogy.
Yeah, and so I think, like I said earlier, I think the average sysadmin, they're so mired down in the day-to-day, right, that you never really get down into the bits and pieces of the boot process. And therefore, it then makes it more difficult to understand some of the dangers that are out there today around this process, right? And so we're going to be talking a lot about this problem. And I just want everybody to remember Secure Boot. A lot of this is through the prism of the Secure Boot feature, which in and of itself, fantastic idea, pairing it with TPM chips. So we have that hardware root of trust, right? So,
that's right.
Basically saying that making it more difficult to boot a particular operating system elsewhere, right? Especially in the case of things like virtual machines, right? Because they're so mobile. And so we're going to get into some of the incidents that undermine this process a little bit. And I think the big one that I want to focus on, Paul, is PKFail, is kind of the name of the incident that that has been talked about. And this, of course, refers to a leak of a platform key. And I guess maybe we should back up here for a second. So in Secure Boot, during the manufacturing process of a given motherboard, a platform key is baked into that motherboard. And that those keys are also imported into operating systems, right? And so during the boot process, the OS and that platform key are, they are compared with each other to see if, this OS is allowed to boot on this hardware, essentially. And so this whole idea is built on the predication that platform key will not get loose in the wild, right? Well, what do you think happened? So in 2023, basically one of these platform keys was leaked into the wild. And so that particular platform key was used for 800 different motherboard models across 10 different vendors. So just looking at that alone, so now you have 800 different motherboard models where the platform key is now in the wild. If I'm a threat actor, I can take that platform key and basically, as far as an operating system is concerned, I can pretend to be that motherboard from a secure boot perspective, right?
They can basically assign their malware with that key and get into the machine, nothing stopping them. Now, it's even worse than that, because it's not like a key was leaked. The
Right.
reason this is the same key across 800 different motherboard models or lines of devices and across so many vendors is because it's a test key. The
Right.
key is literally called something like test, don't use in production. And so everybody used it in production. Which you just facepalm just like you just did. I mean, it's just like, excuse me, who was sleeping on the job here, and not who was sleeping at one company, but who was sleeping across
Multiple.
nearly a dozen of them.
Right.
Oh, and we're not talking about small vendors here, by the way. So we will give you the GitHub link to where you can go and read up about all the models that are affected by PKFail, and you want to go there and check out. But we are talking Dell, HP, Lenovo. Gigabyte has got a lot of them.
Yep.
So yeah, like this is definitely a facepalm moment.
It is, and it's
Oh,
when I look at it in its entirety, it's really it's almost frustrating because we had this great idea, this fantastic idea of secure boot. We're going to verify that, this hardware is legit hardware that's allowed to boot the operating system. I mean, from a security perspective, great idea. And then it's like, I don't even know an analogy for this. I mean, it's like somebody tied their shoelaces together before they even started walking, and then they just fell flat on their face, right? I mean, uh, and it's
baby.
yeah,
Somebody designed a house with fantastic locks on doors and windows, and then went and opened the garage door that leads straight into the house. Like that's literally what happened here. Like they had all the right intentions, and then they literally just, I don't know. It's it's a bit of a terrible experience. I mean, I suppose we should also talk about the fact that one of the reasons this happens is because PC manufacturing is a very low margin business.
right.
Like, not like Dell and HP and Lenovo are making 40% on each machine they sell. I don't know what the margins are,
Yeah, that's
but they're
true.
not huge, right? So what actually should happen, I did try to find that interview, but I couldn't find it. A couple of years ago, I listened to an interview with a guy who's involved in literally this at one of the motherboard manufacturers. And he said what should happen is that these keys should be stored in hardware security modules, as
Right.
in secure boxes in data centers. They should not be floating around in GitHub, and they should certainly not be floating around inside the organization even. That's the level of security that they really should have, but that is not what happens. So yeah, and I suppose we should probably tie into why this is so important to give the background here. So there's two types of malware that we're focusing on here today. One is a bootkit, and the other one is a rootkit. So a bootkit is a piece of malware that inserts itself in the boot process without being blocked by secure boot, etc. One of the ways you can do that is if you have a motherboard that has a PKFail leaked trusted key or test
Yep.
key, then you can take that test key and you're good to go. But there's various other ways of doing that. A rootkit, on the other hand, is a piece of malware that runs before the operating system runs. So it sits underneath the operating system. And one of the reasons that is so dangerous or so difficult for like an EDR, an endpoint detection and response tool, to deal with is because it can lie to the operating system. So it can have files on the hard drive, and if you go and look in Explorer or you're trying to see those files, they're not even visible. Like they're
Yeah.
just not there. And so that's an acceptable, that's a nice workaround. And sometimes a bootkit is also a rootkit. You got both in the same place. So that's why leaking your keys is a bad idea.
Right. Exactly. And if you want to go out and read about some examples of bootkits and rootkits in the wild. I've got a couple of links that I'm going to put in the show notes that might be some interesting reading for everybody. Certainly go into more detail and a deeper dive on some of the stuff than we're able to in the 35 minutes that we usually do on the show here. But if you want to do a quick Google search for Cosmic Strand and Black Lotus. Those are some good examples for you to read up on. So, and I think the really malicious thing about these, and I think we've kind of alluded to this, but I just want to be very clear here. is that with a rootkit and a bootkit, they are both so early in the boot process, so deeply ingrained into the system that you were saying before we hit record on this, Paul. It's like you get one of these and you might as well just chuck the machine into a wood chipper, right? Because I mean, this malware persists across OS installs. You can reinstall the operating system and the malware is still there, folks. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
the real
and
malicious thing about these.
that's right, you're absolutely right? Because the normal progression of an incident response, right? When you have a breach, you have a large-scale compromise, is you either have an in-house team or you bring in some experts if you're smaller. They go through your environment, they figure out how the bad guys got in, they gather all the logs they need, they figure out which systems were affected, where they see persistence by the bad guys, and then you re-image machines, right? So
Yep.
you start re-imaging all the machines, maybe you even re-image servers, you restore data from backup, all of that's happening. And if you are dealing with a rootkit or a bootkit, and that's in play, you are not getting rid of the bad guys because they literally will have an agent on your machines that they can go back to. And if that's where you land, if that's where you actually get I mean, there might be scenarios where you might be able to flash the firmware, maybe, but are
Maybe.
you really going to trust that?
I
I mean,
wouldn't.
depending on your incident response and depending on your insurance, it might literally be, hey, take these 1,000 laptops and as you said, chuck them in a wood chipper and let's just buy some new ones. It's just
Right.
everybody gets a new machine. Yay!
Because like you said, it all comes down to trust. If I know that this laptop on my desk had a rootkit on it at one point in time, and like you said, it can lie to the OS. And so at that point, I'm not going to trust a single thing from that machine in any way, shape, or form.
And the terrible thing is you can't even. So one of my clients is a school, right? So when their machines get old, we donate them somewhere, right, where they go to recycling and they re-image them and then they
Right?
send them to somebody else who's less fortunate to have that machine, right? Well, you can't really do that. It's an awful thing to do to somebody, give them an infected machine, right?
Oh,
So it's literally they've just got to be destroyed and that's it.
right. Right. So, we've kind of talked about the problem. And I want to also highlight here is that secure boot and all these different boot security technologies we've talked about kind of set out to solve this rootkit issue, right? And we have PKFail. Another one that we didn't mention is there was an Intel specific leak where the keys, the private keys for Intel Boot Guard were leaked as well too. I'm going to put the link to that in the show notes. Just another set of keys, basically, right? And so what we have here is really a digital supply chain issue, but also kind of a hardware issue at the same time, right? Because we had these alleged secure keys that were embedded onto all this hardware, depending on your vendor, right? There you mentioned before the show, Paul, that Apple controls their entire supply chain. Same thing with Microsoft and their Surface devices. So those enclosed supply chains don't suffer from this particular issue. And of course, you mentioned also before the show, you're going to pay a premium for that, especially on the Apple side, right? Is because they control the whole experience from start to finish. There's a premium for that anyway. um, so it really comes down to a supply chain issue, and um, it's difficult to solve this issue because even though all the best efforts were made for this great secure boot technology to be pushed out into the wild, there is no mechanism in place to make easy mass changes to that platform key on thousands and thousands and thousands of endpoints, right? To my knowledge, you have to be sitting in front of the machine in order to do anything of that nature at that level of the boot process because it's in the firmware. There's no OS to remote into at that stage. And I don't know if there's anything in like the Intel vPro stuff. I know vPro has some like ILO and iDRAC type features, right? If for those that don't know, ILO and iDRAC are HP and Dell like sub OS remote capabilities, right? But I know vPro
No,
has
we
some of that
normally
stuff, but I don't know if it has any ability to do anything with the platform keys.
Well, I'm not sure either. So integrated lights out from HP and integrated Dell remote access something
Yeah, I
C
think
something
that's right.
iDRAC.
Yeah, I think that's
So
right.
this is what you normally would find on servers, right? Where you can remote into the server even if the operating system isn't working, and you can access the UEFI on a server remotely.
Yep.
Because servers are often stored in data centers and you don't really have access to them. And if they don't reboot the operating system properly, you need to have some sort of access to get to them. Whereas that's generally not something we worry too much about on endpoint devices.
Right.
But yes, maybe. But again, now you're going to trust Intel, and they had their leaks.
Exactly.
Well, are you going to trust all of that, or are you sitting there? Maybe you're hiring, a few interns and making sure you're paying them properly to go around to every single machine and doing this manually on each of them.
Yep.
Uh,
Exactly.
it's a
And
challenge. I do want to point out too that we're focusing very much on the UEFI firmware here and the boot process and how that ties into TPM and secure boot and all that other stuff.
yep.
But again, I couldn't find this recording either. But a couple of years ago, I watched a really interesting talk where somebody who was a hardware expert expanded the scope because there's firmware in lots of other places. Your network card has a firmware.
That's
That
true.
firmware is vulnerable, right? Your storage device has a firmware. That is vulnerable, right? So there is firmware in lots of other, but your graphics card definitely has a firmware. That's also vulnerable, right? And a lot of these are places where you can hide as an attacker, right? So there's not just one. And I would think that if I was an adventurous hacker or a criminal with a big R&D budget, getting into the network firmware seems like a really nice place to be, because now you could start sending packets to other machines on the network and compromise their network firmware on their NICs, network interface cards, which would be nice. So yeah. Come to the Security Swarm podcast for your criminal tips and tricks of the week. How to do your attacks.
Or the information that will keep you awake at night, right? That's a possibility as well, too.
That's true.
So I guess ultimately we come to like, okay, if I'm a sysadmin in the trenches and, I go and take a look at the GitHub repo that Andy posted in the show notes, and I see that a bunch of the machines in my fleet are on this list. What am I to do about that? And I think you kind of mentioned it already, right? It's like, okay, let's document the process for, mitigating PKFail and hand the needed information and probably a couple of USB keys and whatever the interns need and send them around and touch every machine, right? It's not pretty, but it'll get the job done, right? But
yeah, and there are links in that GitHub repo to the different manufacturers and if you have hundreds of machines, you don't want to just cowboy this. You're probably contacting your vendor, right?
Yep.
You're saying, hey, we've got X number of these machines on this list. What's the steps here? And they will obviously, their support will at least have a good documented process for how you should approach this problem and fix it.
Right.
But yeah, ultimately, I suppose the one other thing I should mention, you should probably, even if you're a small, medium business, but certainly if you're a large business, you want to get yourself a good vulnerability management tool, because that will inventory what you have as far as firmware. Right. So, for example, for one of my clients, I use Microsoft's Defender XDR suite and the vulnerability management add-on. And that actually identifies vulnerable versions, not just to PKFail, but to all different, revealed CVEs in firmware in devices. So you can see, and it also tells you which version you need to upgrade to. And it gives you a link to the manufacturer's website. What are the steps you need to do to get that firmware up to date? Right. So that's probably another thing to because we're focusing on one single issue here, but it's much bigger than that. Firmware is something you need to keep up to date. Like we've learned over the years that, hey, you need to keep your Windows up to date, you need to keep your Office up to date, and all your third-party software, right? And that's important. We got Patch Tuesday. But I think most people don't think about firmware. They don't think that that is important. Like, it's a small piece of software. It really only boots the computer. How important can that be? Well, as we've seen here, because it's part of secure boot, if it's compromised, everything else is essentially useless. I do want to point out one thing, though, because we have sort of focused on this problem, and certainly this is a problem that you should take seriously. But if you're a small or medium business, maybe you're a single IT admin and you're trying to cope with everything that's on your plate,
Right.
right? A small medium business is less likely to get compromised by these incidents or these vulnerabilities than all the other things, right? You don't have MFA on, or somebody clicks on a phishing link, or I don't know, somebody finds a USB stick in the car park and plugs it in, any of the sort of, or falls for a BEC scam, right? Business email compromise, and they wire some money to somebody's account that they shouldn't wire it to. So we're not saying, hey, this is the most important security risk you need to focus on, but you do need to be aware that firmware is an issue, and that you do want to be on top of it and update them.
Right, definitely. And like we talk about so much on this show, it all comes down to risk profile, right? And we've mentioned so many times that you don't want to get, tunnel vision on these more obscure, more complex attacks, and then leave the front door open. No multi-factor authentication, no, EDR running on endpoints, things like that, right? Don't forget the basics, because that's no good. And I guess the one thing that maybe we didn't cover a whole lot was just the attack vector, right? And so in a lot of cases, the attacker has to already have, very privileged access to the machine to leverage this a rootkit type of attack to begin with, right?
Yeah.
And so they're already in your environment if they've been able to, place a rootkit somewhere. And if I was a threat actor and I had the ability and the capabilities to drop a rootkit or a bootkit into the infrastructure, that's like my ultimate persistence mechanism, right? You can
Yeah.
kick me out of every other part of the infrastructure. I can still fall back to my old rootkit there, like we talked about earlier. So anyway.
That's right. That's right. And I suppose we should also have, outlined that so far we are seeing these attacks mostly from nation states,
Right.
mostly doing spying, industrial espionage, that sort of thing. We're not seeing this too much with criminals because it is a little bit fiddly and it's a little bit of an extra step. But that's only when it's difficult to do. The problem that I see is that within a few years, we might end up, especially with PKFail and other similar things, we might end up in a situation where this becomes, hey, I just run a script, right? And now it becomes part of the criminal's normal playbook, right? They compromise a machine, they get in, they start moving laterally, and they just run that script as an extra little thing to dump in their little bootkit into giving them persistence. And if it's that easy that they can do it reliably across different machine types, then we have a problem.
Right.
We definitely have a problem.
For sure. And it's that's kind of the evolution of attacks, right? Is like the nation state actors start with them first, and then typically they end up over in the hacktivists' hands, and then from there it's your cyber criminals go after them at that point, right? It's kind of
And then the script kiddies.
Right, and then the script kiddies, of course. We can't forget the script kiddies, so.
And generally, before all of that, before you get the nation states, a lot of those are in academic papers or presented at high-level security conferences, right, as a possible attack.
Right.
And then a few years later, nation states, and a year later, it's in the criminals' hands, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Yep, for sure. So, well, we could probably do a whole nother episode digging further into this topic, but I think we probably covered enough for one day, and we've probably given listeners a bunch to think about as part of this episode. So probably call it good there, Paul. I want to thank you for your time, as always, to come and talk to us about Windows security concerns. Oh, this isn't specifically Windows, but any machine, right? So but yeah, good to have you as always, my friend.
No, that was fun. And again, just underlining, please go and look at the links. Please read up and just check whether you have machines that are vulnerable to this one or not.
For sure. Yeah, definitely check out that GitHub link if you only have time to look at one of those links. Take a look at the GitHub repo because that's definitely the one you want. But otherwise, yes, read up on the links that are down there. With that, we'll let everybody go here. So hopefully you found some value in today's episode, and if you did, be sure to smash that like and subscribe button if you're watching out on the YouTubes. Otherwise, we are available on all the major podcasting platforms, so chances are you can find us wherever you consume your content. With that, we'll let you get back to your day. Stay safe out there, and we'll catch you again next week for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Have a good one.